Of course, there is a pretty good argument to be made for the vampires being an other, a devil, as has been pointed out before. But also, it is a way for us to think of what exactly makes those people others, because the vampires can be somewhat of a blank slate when it comes to what they do and what they think. So, some vampires fly and some vampires shapeshift and some vampires are scared of the light and some vampires can't see themselves in the mirror and whatever. And so the myths that go around what vampires do and how they behave are very varied because they have a pretty long history of being around us. And this is kind of a easy way to make sense out of the aspect of blood that I've mentioned just a couple of videos ago, because when we see the amount of blood that the vampires can take from us, then they can turn us into more or less being like them. And conversely, however much blood we can keep to ourselves makes them less powerful, makes them less vampires. And it is kind of interesting to see how, in the pre-scientific mind, when people used to think about blood or that fluid that is in our body that was not made sense out of in the modern way, blood had to be classified, and science had to be classified into the science that worked, the experimental science, the testable science, and the science that seemed based more on the superstition anyway. So for this kind of transitional period of identity, I suppose, or scientific process, we started to make sense of the various ways that science could more or less help us. Here, one can scarcely credit that at any period there could have existed men of science and genius who believed that there were supernatural means of curing disease. Did we not even to the present day find imbeciles who verily dread the malpractices of the devil and his vicarious agents? So this is 1837, pretty tough words to be used with people who believe in supernatural cures, but ancient writers divided their cures into lawful and unlawful. The former were obtained from divine aid, so cures that come from God are lawful superstitions, but then the latter from sorcerers, witches, magicians, wizards, and cunning men who treated all maladies by spells, cabalistic words, charms, characters, images, amulets, ligatures, filters, incantations, etc. And so those would be the unlawful cures that are very varied and need to be listed as opposed to, well, the divine aid. And, the God in the one form can solve everything, and anything other than God is not good. And you don't need to exemplify more of that. And, all those other names, and we've mentioned before, the devil has many names. All those other names, this kind of disunity that exist in those various practices is quickly discarded as being inapplicable. And so at this point in time in this particular class, there should be no mystery to us that we have these connections between the old science and the new science and the old ideas and the new ideas, and especially in the context of this particular book called Curiosities of Medical Experience. So again, from the early 19th century, kind of looking back at what would have been otherwise considered superstitions of science. The idea of mythology was very important in making sense of this science. The ancients firmly believed that blood can be staunched by charms. The bleeding of Ulysses was stopped by this means. Then Cato the censor had given us an incantation for setting dislocated bones. To this day, charms are supposed to arrest the flow of blood. Tom Potts was but a serving man, but yet he was a doctor good. And he bound his kerchief on the wound, and with some kind words he staunched the blood. Or blood, I guess, if you speak Middle English, I suppose. Sir Walter Scott says, in the Lay of the Last Minstrel, she drew the splinter from the wound, and with a charm she staunched the blood. So the possibility of stopping a hemorrhage, stopping the life juice from flowing out of our veins could be achieved by by believing in the right thing. Essentially, the strength of imagination in effecting wonderful cures has been observed in all ages, and as Avicenna declares, that he prefers confidence of art, precepts, and all remedies whatsoever. So if you just believe in it, it will work. Whatever the other cures, whatever the other solutions to your problem might be, just believing that things are going to work is probably enough to cure most ills. And this is probably a matter of somatic practices. If you're already depressed, if you're already feeling bad, and you don't see the you don't see the way out of your current ailment, it becomes that much more complicated to cure that ailment because your whole body is kind of reacting badly to treatment and to whatever cure, however efficient it might otherwise be. And in the sense that we can put all kinds of effects on the way that vampires work, they do tend to gather a bunch of various forms that are also very identifiable as the forms of others, the forms of spirits that are not like us, even though they are, well, by all accounts, kind of like us. They have these subtle differences that we can see that are clearly not like the way that humans work. And how do we account for these things? How do we account for these various forms that can come and go in various times, but also kind of taking over us in a way? This extract here from ancient Akkadian poem dated from 1,000 years before Common Era, uh, transcribes the various forms of spirits that existed for the Acadians. The wicked Otuku who slays men alive on the plain. So the spirit that kills people. The wicked Alu who covers man like a garment, the one that wraps him around, maybe in his big wings. The wicked Adimu, the wicked Galu who bind the body, the one who hold us hostage. The Lame, Lamashtu, the Lamea, Labasu who cause disease in the body. The disease comes from the bad spirits. And the Lilu who wanders the plain, a wandering spirit, werewolf, a vampire, I don't know. They have come nigh unto a suffering man on the outside. They have brought about a painful malady in his body. So each one of those different spirits in the ancient Akkadian culture were kind of taking over the human body in various ways, more or less spiritual, more or less physical, more or less internally, and kind of causing all kinds of ailments. And if we talk about what we mentioned before, these vampires kind of in the article that was the article reading that there's vampires that kind of discover their identity as vampires around the ritual of teenage. And this is when you realize your identity as a person. This is also when you realize the identity that you will be as a grown up. And whether you like that or don't like that, you kind of have to go over that threshold of teenage to adulthood, and you kind of have to assume that identity mostly for the rest of your life, unless you seek on reinventing yourself and maybe becoming some kind of a trickster as a result. So you can see this as a form of mental illness. You can see this as a form of physical illness. You can just see it as any kind of way that makes sense to you in the terms of the spirit. But of course, today we have associated all of those with different parts of our science. But if you think of those things as being in our blood, some way or somehow taking over the physical circulation of our body, it becomes pretty clear that there is a way in which our existence would be tied to this existence of the blood, and maybe that we, the humans, have a kind of blood that allows us to live a certain way, as opposed to the kind of blood that vampires have that allows them to live in a different way. And well, for the most part, those two kinds of blood don't mix unless the vampires bite us, unless the spirits get us. And once they get us, there's no going back. Henry Clay Turnbull talks about this in the context of a sacrifice. It would seem to be because of such cramping that no one of the modern students of myth and folklore, of primitive ideas and customs, of man's origin and history has brought into their true prominence, if indeed he has noticed them in passing, the universally dominating primitive convictions. That of the blood is the life, that the heart as the blood fountain is the very soul of every personality, that blood transfer is soul transfer, that blood sharing human or divine humans secures an interunion of natures, and that a union of the human nature with the divine is the highest ultimate attainment reached out by the most primitive as well as by the most enlightened man of humanity. So, in the physical world, we may or may not mix our blood with that of others, which means that we would be mixing our soul with that of others. And so we would become others by, let's say, marrying somebody of a different racial group, perhaps, which some people would consider to be a bad thing. Although, of course, you could also choose to bind your body and your soul with that of the divine, with that of God, and to the religious orders with, well, some people, perhaps the same, would recognize as the good thing, the bestest thing in a way. So the admixtures that we are willing to make with our blood, maybe the sacrifices that we are willing to make with our lives, are the ones that will eventually define us individually, and maybe if you expand that to a much larger group, to expand that as a group, maybe a racial group, maybe a social group, a cultural group. I'm not sure. It's very difficult to make sense out of this in our current states. But remember, when Vlad the Impaler, who became the Impaler, he was fighting for his nation, his group of people, against the Christians from the north, against the Muslims from the south, and he became this folk hero to a lot of people who were refusing this racial mixing, this cultural mixing, this kind of this transfer of somebody else's soul or some other group's soul into their collective soul, somebody else's population into their collective population, and as a result of that, this vampire kind of became a monster, a scary monster. At least to those who were not able to defeat him. Eventually, as we saw, the British saw him as much less of a threat. So the idea that this could all happen in the blood is very deep, without any pun intended here, because it is kind of attaching us to our nature, if there is such a thing as humans, and what it is to have a true nature as a human, maybe a pure nature as a human, one that is not mixed with that of others. Of course, the others in the grandest sense of the devil in the Christian imaginary, but also in the context of any kind of other people around that. And as Ed Frazier pointed out, all these hundreds of years ago, or 120, no, yeah, 130 years ago, one of the most common form of taboo that exists in everywhere around the world is that around blood. The blood taboo, is probably based on the common belief that the soul or spirit of the animal is in the blood. The animal, including humans, of course. As tabooed persons are believed to be in a perilous state, for example, the relations of the slain man are liable to the attacks of the indignant ghost, it is especially necessary to isolate them from contact with spirits, and hence the prohibition on touch raw meat. So, well, as we've mentioned before, if you say the ghost's name, they come to you. Maybe if you touch the ghost's appearance, they come to you. If you do those, if you cross those borders of blood to substance or blood to other blood, you are kind of calling the devil upon you. But as usual, the taboo is only the special enforcement of a general precept. In other words, its observance is particularly enjoined in circumstances which seem urgently to call for its application, but apart from such circumstances, the prohibition is also observed, though less strictly, as a common rule of life. Thus, some of the Estonians will not taste blood because they believe that it contains the animal's soul, and which would enter the body of the person who tasted the blood. Some Indian tribes of North America, through a strong principle of religion, abstain in the strictest manner from eating the blood of any animal, as it contains the life and spirit of the beast. Jewish hunters poured out the blood of the game they had killed and covered it up with dust. They would not taste the blood, believing that the soul of life of the animal was in the blood, or actually was the blood. And I'm sure you know about kosher food, and perhaps you know about halal food for Muslims. This is not unique, of course, to Jewish practices. This is very common in Abrahamic practices. You also probably know about some food interdictions that go alongside Christianity. For example, not eating meat on Fridays because, of course, you have the blood of Jesus Christ that is involved in this conversation, right? So all of these kind of attempts to separate us and maybe animal us from human us, or maybe the human us from the God us. All of these are very important in maintaining this barrier between the humans and whoever they are. And in a more modern sense, you can make that same argument about people seeing blood in an accident, or maybe menstrual blood, referring to women, whether or not that is a taboo. Again, something that is perfectly natural and perfectly normal that happens in day-to-day life, but that is kind of kept out of our imaginary, kept out of our current discourse because it kind of carries this taboo around it. And this happens as much around the Western American culture as it happens in other places everywhere. Another way that we can mix things is material things, and there's a pretty good argument to be made that purity in this context is one way that the vampires can be fought. For example, precious metals such as gold and silver, especially silver, is associated with being a vampire repellent. Here from Milligan, again, that the book that I mentioned at the beginning, from these this curious curiosities of medical experiences. That's what it was. Witches and imposters, says Francis Bacon, have always held a competition with physicians. Galen complains of this superstition and observes that patients place more confidence in the oracles of Aesculapius and their own idle dreams than the prescriptions of doctors. The introduction of precious stones into medical practice owes its origin to a superstitious belief that from their beauty, splendor, and high value, they were the natural receptacles for good spirits. Mystery in the Dark Ages and LS. So at some point, it became part of medical practice to use these metals as something that is good, beautiful, valuable, something that would attract the good into the human body and perhaps even make it better, used as a cure. And certainly this became also part of our common imaginary with crystals, for example, being quote unquote pure or not really pure, whatever, however you picture those crystals to be, the idea being that they maybe carry a good vibration, or maybe that the mineral content within them carries more or less good beneficial effects. The when you call a thing a crystal, it has this idea of being crystal clear as opposed to it being a mineral that has less clearness to it, like salt or whatever. So this is something that is definitely important, and in the context of medical practice, something that we have forgotten now because we very much have these quote unquote drugs or quote unquote medicine that are helping us make sense out of most illnesses, and those are mixed, are chemical, and as a result, sometimes they get a bad name. You might have heard about what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Anyway, the vampires, which is the subject of today, are a pretty good way for us to realize exactly where we are on the spectrum of mankind, and especially because the vampires have this physical, emotional, kind of full body reaction to the things that are scary to them, things that we, the not vampires, are very familiar with. So we are believers in God. So by believing in God, we are therefore better already, and we can show this with material proof, such as the crucifix, which, as you can see in this picture, repels Dracula. The holy water, which is also used to repel vampires, as I'm sure you know. We are also inherently healthy because we love the sunlight, and sunlight, of course, is healthy, and we eat garlic, apparently healthy food, although again, in in the grand scheme of things, garlic doesn't have particularly good properties. And also, well, we have money, we have science, and we can use our best precious metals, and we can actually use silver weapons to repel the vampires. Although, again, right, silver comes much later, and this is not part of the early stories of vampires. They become more important in the 19th century. But vampire, sorry, silver being kind of a single metal, being solid, being pure, being a naturally occurring substance is often used to repel spirits and especially repel these shapeshifters. So these characters that don't have a particular identity, including the werewolf, silver bullets and whatnot. So at the end of the day, all of these different cures allow us humans to become better than those monsters, than those horrors that we see. And because we have the technology for it, because we have the knowledge of it, we can use all of that we have accumulated to fight these quote unquote others. At least, if we want to, because they also have this sexual magnetism, this darkness to themselves, which seem appealing, which appeal to a more primal us. But the more advanced us, of course, would certainly fight the vampires. And this is exactly where the ritual becomes important and crucial, even because some of these different cures may not work. But then once you burn the vampire, once you put a stake through their heart, once you put a coin in their mouth to allow the safe passage of their soul um, back to wherever they came from, hell, paradise, or whatever, they can finally remain at peace and no longer be a bother to us. So, doing the proper ritual of burial and doing all of the proper respects to the dead is what would allow for the vampires to disappear altogether from our lives. The extract here from Danforth points out that eventually this becomes the most efficient weapon against vampires in many societies throughout the world. Dying is a slow process of transition from one state, life, to another, death. In these societies, the burial, which occurs soon after death, is temporary and provisional, and the funeral marks only the beginning of a long and highly celebrated liminal period. Again, we've talked about this before, during which a person is neither fully alive nor fully dead. During this period of transition, the corpse decomposes until all the flesh has decayed and only the bones remain. The end of the liminal period is marked by rites of secondary burial or secondary treatment, during which the remains of the deceased are recovered, ritually treated, burned or whatever, and moved to a new location where they are permanently stored, you know, under the earth and whatnot. So, figuring out this process of mourning, figuring out this process of transition, and kind of allowing our bodies and our souls to carry through those stages is a lot more important than any one of the technologies that we have found out during this day. And eventually, of course, this is the biggest lessons we can learn from this.